It is good to be able to reclaim the pulpit, or most of it anyway. After this morning's festivities, and I appreciate so much Glenn and Gary both being here. And as I said this morning, I don't think it's possible to overstate the influence that they've had on me. And personally, Glenn was my preacher as a child. As I was growing up, he's the one that I think of, and he's kind of the guy that when I think of who is a preacher, I think of Glenn Elliott. And when I was, I think, 11 or 12 years old, and Vacation Bible School was going on, and I was too old to be in Vacation Bible School, but he still wanted me there, and he brought me in every day, and he worked on a lesson with me. Glenn, do you happen to know what that lesson was about? Yeah, it didn't leave an impact on Glenn, but it left an impact on me, and I think 11 or 12 years old, about sixth grade age, he helped me work on a lesson, and it was the 5 points of salvation, and we made it into a lesson kind of using the bases of a baseball field, because I was still playing baseball at that time and enjoyed baseball, and so first base and second base and third base and reaching around to home to find salvation, and that was about, goodness, 39, almost 40 years ago. So that was my very first sermon that I got to preach on a Sunday evening at the end of Vacation Bible School, and that was just an important moment in my life, and it let me know that I could get up here and do this, and here I am still doing it. So blame him. And then when we got the opportunity to move here, Glenn and Colleen remained such a large part of our lives, and it didn't. Tracy had already known Glenn and Colleen at that point, but of course I had a stronger connection. But it didn't take her long to fall under Colleen's spell. And a quick story about that: on the way home from our very first LTC, we're riding home on the bus from LTC, and it's been a long weekend, and we're both worn out and tired, and I was sure I'd made so many mistakes they might run me off, but my heart was so full, and I was just feeling so happy about the fact that we were here and that we were able to be a part of this. And I looked over at my sweet wife, and I just kind of gently said to her, "I love you." She looked back at me and said, "I love Colleen." Said, "That's okay. I'm okay with that. I love Colleen too." It was not the response I was looking for, but it was okay. And then Gary has had his influences on me as well, counting being one of those influences, and learning to make announcements like, this is our first annual of whatever it is that we're doing, and you just announce it that way. And I'll never forget the first time that Rich learned they were having the first annual fish fry at their house when Gary announced it. Gary announced it up here one night. "We'll have our first annual fish fry at Rich and Vicky's house." And Rich said, "We will?" That was a great night. And we're still doing it. And then I don't know if you'll remember sending home with Michael when he was down there for the lectureships or whatever, a bottle of banana flavored syrup. And Michael called me up here and he gave me, I thought, what am I going to do with this stuff? I don't have a snow cone maker. And so I had that bottle of stuff at home for a while, and then I put just a little dollop, a little splash, maybe a tablespoon or two in a cup of unsweetened tea, and it was then sweet tea, and it tasted like bananas. And do you know they sell that by the case on Amazon? They do sell it by the case on Amazon. And there's the remains of a case in my cabinet at home right now. So you started something there, Gary. I don't know if you can tell, but I love these fellas, and my heart is full after the time that we've been able to spend here today. And I feel a little bit, I think maybe the way the kids at LTC felt was they go in to sit before the judges or to perform their task before the judges, and and hope that they measure up. And that'll be something that I strive for a long time, is to measure up to the men that have gone on before me. So I appreciate their influence and all that they've meant to me and my family over the years. Okay, now for the lesson. I appreciate you indulging me in those moments of reminiscing. We'll be in Hebrews tonight. And I wanted to talk about some things from Hebrews chapter 11, and you can't just jump right into Hebrews chapter 11. It seems like you've got to kind of lay some groundwork, some foundation for the things that are going on in the book of Hebrews itself, and what the Hebrew writer is trying to accomplish, before just jumping into that list that it's probably the most well-known chapter in Hebrews. It's probably the passage that people would recognize if you start reading from Hebrews chapter 11 and just pulling out little bits and pieces of it. But I think perhaps that if we treat it that way, that if we just treat it as sort of a hall of fame, or if we treat it as a list of really great people, that maybe we miss the impact or the overall point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make about why all of these people are listed and about why their great accomplishments are put on display before us. And so I want to back up a little bit and just kind of talk about Hebrews itself, and not to give a full synopsis of the book, but basically the overall theme of the book is Jesus is better. Jesus is better. He's better than Moses. He's better than Aaron as the high priest. He's got better promises. There's a better covenant. There's just go down the list of things that you know about Jesus, and everything about Jesus is better than what the Jewish nation had as part of the Old Covenant. Not that anything in the Old Covenant was bad. It's not a knock against the Old Covenant. It's not a knock against the Old Testament. It's not a knock against Moses or Aaron or any of the people that are mentioned. It's not that they were, it's not that they weren't what they were supposed to be. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. They were the people that they were supposed to be, and they accomplished the things that God set before them to accomplish. But ultimately, Jesus is better. And so when you have a group of people, when you have a group of Christians that come from that Jewish background that are kind of missing those old ways, that are facing some persecution because of their newfound faith, and they're considering leaving that faith to go back into what they knew, what was comfortable, what had got them to this point in their lives, it's important for them to understand that if they give up what they have now and they go back into something else, they're giving up what is better, and they're going back into something that is insufficient, that is not as good. And so all of these things are laid out throughout the book of Hebrews, and it's a tremendous study just to go through and look point by point and chapter by chapter at all of those things that are drawn out as to what is better under the new covenant, what is better under Christ than we had it under the old law. And so that, with that kind of overarching theme in mind, we get into chapter 10, and in chapter 10 we have this section in verses 19 through 31 where we're basically given two choices. We have two options laid out before us, and in the first option, verses 19 through 25, since therefore, brethren, we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and to good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So here's choice one laid out for us, and there's a couple of senses there. Since we have access to God the Father, and we do through Christ. We have access in a way we have access to the Father in a way that under the old covenant they didn't have. If they wanted to go to the Father under the old covenant, they had to go to the temple or the tabernacle, and the priest had to make intercession for them, and only the priest could enter into the Holy of Holies, and he could only do that once a year. And that judgment seat on the Ark of the Covenant, where God's throne was, and where he sat in judgment over the people, that could only be approached once a year, and only by a certain person, and only after they had observed all the rituals. But now we have access to God in a way that we never had access to God under that old covenant. And since that's true, and it is, since it's true, and since Christ is our high priest, and so under the old covenant we had descendants of Aaron who were high priests, and they were corruptible men. They were sometimes did good jobs, sometimes did bad jobs. Sometimes they observed the things exactly the way they should, but more often than not there were problems with the way that they did things. And even when they were a good high priest, they still had to offer sacrifice for their own sin. They still had to make atonement for themselves before they could then make atonement for the people. So since we have access to the Father in ways that we never had under the old covenant, and since we have a high priest who can make intercession for us in a way that has never been able to happen before, since those things are true, let us draw near. Let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith. We have full assurance and faith that God is there, that He is listening, that He is able to hear us, that He is willing to listen, that He is desirous of a relationship with us. Let us also hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Let's cling to that, because to give it up is unthinkable. To give it up is, how can you possibly consider the idea of giving up that access to God? How can you possibly consider giving up a high priest who doesn't have to atone for his own sins before he can atone for yours? It makes no sense. Let us hold fast that confession of our hope without wavering, for He who promised is faithful. And not only that, but let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and to good deeds. I think there might not be a better verse in Hebrews to go along with our theme for the quarter and the things that we've talked about today already than to consider the idea of how we as God's people can stimulate one another to love and to good deeds. It's one thing for me to think about how I need to fulfill that and how I need to be doing the things that represent love and show love to everyone else, but how can I encourage you to do that? How can I stimulate you to demonstrate the love that Christ has placed within us, to demonstrate the love that Christ has given us? And so all of these things are presented here by the Hebrew writer. This is choice number one. This is what's laid out for us, to cling fast to that, to hold on to that covenant and to hold on to what God has given us without wavering, because all of those things about Him are true. And so that's option one, and I think it was presented this morning. You know, how many options are there really? There's one. We either love our brother or we hate our brother. That was what was presented this morning. But here it's this: we either hold fast to that, we either cling to what God has given us, or verses 26 through 31. He says, "For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' and again, 'The Lord will judge his people.' It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God." And so our second choice, if not pursuing Christ, if not pursuing God and following after Him, our second choice is pursuing sin. For to give up on God, to give up on what He has offered us, and to reject His offer is to pursue sin. There's no middle ground. There's no other option. There's no way to paint that in a light that makes it sound better than it is. We either are pursuing God or we are pursuing sin. And he says if we do that, if we sin willfully, if we pursue our own motives, our own direction, if we follow after our own hearts, then there is no longer any sacrifice for sin. You see, even under the Old Testament law, and they tried to do this so many times, and as we've studied through Isaiah, we've seen examples of this, even just in our study last Wednesday night. We see that when they were not doing the right things, but they still tried to appear like they were doing the right things in worship, God rejected that. And so even under the old system, the high priest could not make atonement for a people who were pursuing sin. He might go into the tabernacle or the temple, and he might offer the sacrifice, and he might sprinkle the blood, and he might do all of the right things. But if the people were pursuing sin, atonement was not achieved. If we willfully follow after sin, if we reject God's ways, then there is no sacrifice for sin, not from the blood of bulls and goats, not even from the Son of God himself. We cannot pursue sin and be made right with God. And all then that remains are those things that are listed: a terrifying expectation of just judgment, a fire that consumes. And then these words that should put chills down your spine, and not good chills down your spine, but the idea of trampling underfoot the Son of God. Was it enough that he was nailed to a cross for your sins? And for people to reject that sacrifice is to pull him down from that cross and just trample him underfoot, just to abuse the sacrifice that he made, or insulting the Spirit of grace, the Holy Spirit and his message that he has brought forth to us about Christ and what Christ did for us to take that message and to wad it up and throw it away, or to discard it as though it is trash. That's insulting to the Spirit of God. And so those are our two choices. We either cling to God and we respect what he has given us, and we pursue him through the blood of Christ, or we reject him and we pursue sin. And that's it. Those are the two options. We don't get a third choice. We don't have another way to go. And so the two options are laid out there for the readers there in Hebrews chapter 10, of which they want to do. And of course, the Hebrew writer has his agenda. He is definitely on one side, and he's trying to encourage them and push them and prod them in the right direction. And he's not pulling any punches. He's not candy coating it for them. He's letting them know exactly where they stand. And so now comes the urging, now comes the pleading with them at the end of chapter 10 about which direction they should go. So verses 32 through 34, he says, remember the former days. Remember where you were and where you came to, and don't just discard it. Don't just get rid of it. He says, remember the former days when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of suffering, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession, an abiding one. And so here it is, remember the former days. And in the former days, they endured a great conflict of suffering. They had been made a public spectacle. You know, it's one thing to suffer privately. It's another thing altogether for that to happen out in front of everybody, for them to see it. Think about the beatings that Christ took, and when he was put on trial and people were spitting on him and they were hitting him and they were beating him. It's one thing for that to happen in private, but for that to happen in front of people where they can see it makes that humiliation even greater. And he says, you've already endured that. You've been through it. You felt it. You understand what that's like. You understand the reproaches. You've been through tribulations, and you shared with others who were suffering. You know, those who are parents will understand that when your child is truly suffering, I mean, there's a sickness or an illness or an injury that is not just one of those typical, summertime colds or something, but a true difficulty. What parent is there that wouldn't take that on for themselves and alleviate the suffering in their child? And so these people had been through these things, not only themselves, but they'd had to watch their own loved ones go through many of those things as well. And they'd had to share in the suffering of others. And that makes that pain so much more difficult when others are are suffering and you have to sit back and watch. They had suffered the loss of property. But that passage concludes with the thought, all of this has taken place. Remember those former days. And it's not like the remembrances that we've had today where we're thinking back to all the good times. This was think back to all the bad times. Think back to all the bad stuff that's happened. And sometimes people point out all the bad stuff that happened. You're not helping. You're not convincing me here. But the Hebrew writer says, think back to all those bad things. But remember that during all of those things, knowing you had for yourselves, a better possession and an abiding one. You were hoping for something better. In the midst of all of that, you were trusting that there was something better around the corner. There was something better that was going to happen. And now you're to the point where you're ready to give up? After clinging to that hope for so long, after trusting for so long that there was something better, now you're to the point that you want to give up? It doesn't make any sense. And so the Hebrew writer is trying to reinstill within them not a love for suffering, nobody loves that, but trying to rekindle within them that hope that they had through that previous suffering. And the key then is presented in the final verses of chapter 10 here. In verses 35 through 39, he says this, "Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul." See, here's the key. The key is faith. Confidence has a great reward. If you experience those things and you put your confidence in God, then that reward is around the corner and you can make it through those difficult times. And endurance is key. You've got to have endurance to make it through those difficult times to receive what has been promised. And to shrink back is destruction. To give up on it, that's destruction. That lets the bad times win. That lets the persecution and the tribulation and the difficulties, that gives those things the upper hand and allows them to win. But faith preserves the soul. Faith is what gets us through. Faith is what makes everything all right, even in the face of great difficulty. And so now we're ready to look at chapter 11. Because now we understand the context of what's going to be said about faith and why these great heroes of faith are held up for us in such great light. And they're put on a pedestal and they're demonstrating to us what faith can do for us. Because faith is what will preserve our soul. Faith is the thing that will keep us within the blood of Christ and keep us from forsaking that relationship that we have with Him. And it will keep us from falling into that trap of sin. Faith is what is so important. And so let's look at faith for just a few moments. Now, we can't do justice to Hebrews chapter 11 in just a few minutes, but setting it up and now going back on your own and doing some study in Hebrews chapter 11 with that kind of that context that we have from Hebrews chapter 10, let that be a stepping stone for you. Let that be a launching point for your own personal study on faith and to go back and to look at some of these great heroes of faith from Hebrews chapter 11. So let's just look at this. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And all great preachers preach from the New American Standard Bible, so that's what I've been doing, so you'll think I'm a great preacher. But I heard a preacher this morning quote from the NIV, and I didn't know about that. But we'll forgive it this once. But now he's going to have some ammo on me because I'm about to do something worse. How about this, the easy-to-read version? Faith is what makes real the things we hope for. It is proof of what we cannot see. It makes real the things that we hope for. I don't know about you, but when I'm facing difficulty, when I'm facing hardship, when I'm facing pain, I hope for better times. I hope for that to go away. I hope for relief. And it is faith that makes that relief real. It gives me the opportunity to believe that that pain can go away, that that torture can stop. Faith is what preserves our soul. How about this one? The God's Word translation. Faith assures us of things that we expect and convinces us of the existence of the things that we cannot see. Oh, the things that we cannot see. Wasn't Daniel introduced to that idea when he was awaiting answer to a prayer that he had prayed, and the angel finally came to him and had been delayed, I think, for 21 days. And he said, there's a battle going on that you can't even see. There are things going on around you in a realm that is unknown to you, and you can't imagine what God is doing on your behalf. And faith is what tells us those things are happening. Faith is what tells us that God is on our side and that He is fighting those battles for us, and we're not in it alone. We have someone fighting with us and for us. Or how about the International Children's Bible? Faith means being sure of the things that we hope for. And faith means knowing that something is real, even if we don't see it. I like that. I like that simple explanation of what faith is, of being sure that something is real, even when we don't see it. And that's the key to everything that happens in the following verses as we read over and over and over again that phrase, by faith. And then we read about some great work or some great task that was accomplished by one of our heroes of faith. And it comes down to something this simple. They believed it even though they couldn't see it. They understood that it was there even when they couldn't touch it. And that's what we want our faith to be. That's what we want for ourselves. See, next it says about faith in verse 2, it says, for by faith, the men of old, the heroes of old, these great people of faith that are going to be listed in the following verses, they gained approval. Whose approval? God's approval. God looked at what they did based on the faith that they possessed, based on the faith that they exhibited, and God said, yes. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I wanted to see. That's the response I was hoping for out of this person. God looked at their demonstrations of faith and He approved of the things that they did because of the faith that they demonstrated. And then this great example that sets the tone for everything that follows in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3 says, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. When God spoke the world into existence, you could not see that taking place. You could not see His words. You could not see the power. You could not see the voice, but God spoke it. And now the world is, and we look at the world that is, and we understand that God has power, that God's voice has power, that His word means something. Because of what we see, we know that what we can't see is real. That is powerful. That is Job. You know what Job could see? Because here's where the problem is. Here's where the difficulty is for us. The sufferings that challenge our faith are often the very visible things that we can see. I can see the thing that's hurting me. I can feel it. I can point to it. I could give it a name. I know what it is, and it hurts, and it challenges me, and it makes me want to give up. And you want me to believe in something that I can't see. You want me to place my faith in something that I'm not even sure at times is there. And Job demonstrates this for us in the life that he lived and the great faith that he had. And then one day, out of the blue, a servant comes running up to him and he says, all of your livestock is gone. And he could still look at the pens, and he could still look at the fields, and he could see evidence of all the livestock that he used to have, and they were gone. And another servant runs up and he says, the house where your children were gathered has fallen in and all of your children are dead. And Job could go to that house and he could see the rubble and he could see the bodies of his dead children. And then the disease infected his skin and he could see the boils and he could feel the pain, the fire, the itching. And it was all very real. But his faith was in God. And I don't know if you've read the book of Job, but God doesn't show up for another 41 chapters. And all that time, Job defends God even though he can't see him. The things that hurt us, the things that are challenging our faith are often very, very real to us, but our faith is placed in something that we can't see, and that makes it so very difficult at times. We have some other passages that can help us with this thought. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. Paul there says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. What we have around us, we can look out the window and we can see the trees blowing in the wind, and that tells us that there is a God. I can't see God, but I can see evidence of him all around me. God has made it so. He did that on purpose. He gave us evidence of his existence in the very world that he placed us in, so that we are without excuse. Our faith is in something that we cannot see, but he has given us evidence that that faith is well placed. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 18, Paul there again says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. See, Paul has been talking about difficulties. He's been talking about things that can hurt us. And he says those things are temporal, they're physical, they're earthly. And we look past those things and we look at the things that we cannot see. That doesn't even make sense. To look at the things I can't see? But Paul says we have to refocus, and we have to focus our vision on the eternal. And we have to be driven by that, not be driven by the temporal, no matter how bad it hurts, no matter how much we want to give up in the moment. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, for we walk by faith, not by sight. The Hebrew writer is telling us the exact same thing in Hebrews chapters 10 and 11. We walk by faith, not by sight. Those things that are hurting us, those things that are difficult, those things that are tempting us to give up our faith, we look past those and we allow faith to take the reins. We allow faith to take control. And so a couple of examples that I want us to look at from Hebrews chapter 11. As I said, we don't have time to go through the whole chapter, but just a couple of examples of people who did this very thing. They didn't look at what was around them. They looked to what was coming. They looked ahead to what was better. First example I want to look at is verses 8 through 10, the example of Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And so Abraham let what he knew go so that he could go to an unknown place. He knew the place where he'd lived for 75 years. It's where his family was. It's where his business had been. It's where he had made his living. It's where he had married Sarah. He knew that place. And God called him and said, leave that place behind and go somewhere else. And Abraham said, okay, I'll give up what I know to go to some place that I don't know. And he went there and he lived as an alien in a land that had been promised to his heirs. He knew that this land was eventually going to be given to his descendants, but it wasn't going to be his. He got nothing, no possession out of it. No possession of the land itself. And I wish my brother Tim had been here tonight, because there's a verse here, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 10, I have memorized in the Old American Standard Version because when I was a teenager, he taught our class at Eudora, and he made us memorize this verse. For he looked for the city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And I can remember him teaching us that lesson and talking about how Abraham fixed his vision on what God had in store for him. Not on what he had accumulated for himself, not on what he had been able to procure through his own business acumen or through his own dealings with other people, but he gave all of that up and he went on to take what God had prepared for him. Abraham let go of what he knew in order to grab hold of something that he had never seen. That's faith. We also look at verses 13 through 16. And this is kind of a mini summary of the ones he's already talked about, kind of midway through the chapter, before he continues on with his real thoughts about specific people and then summarizes finally at the very end of the chapter. He says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth, for those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. All of these died in faith. They died chasing after the dream that God laid before them and pursuing the thing that God had put on their heart to pursue. And he said they didn't receive that promise. Abraham never received the actual inheritance that was promised to him. David never actually received that throne that one of his future descendants was going to sit upon. So many times we can look through all of these great heroes of faith, and the promise that was made to them was not something that they actually received in their own time, but they all lived in faith, chasing after that thing which God put before them and accepting what God gave them. It says they embraced the promises from a distance, and they considered themselves as strangers and exiles. This world is not my home. I'm living a life of faith, thinking about what God has procured for me in a future home. And that's the way they treated it. He said they could go back to their home anytime they wanted to. If they wanted to give up the dream, if they wanted to give up the faith, they could go back. But God was calling them forward, and they all chose to follow. They were seeking a better country, a heavenly one. And this passage ends, I don't know how you read that without imagining how God feels about you. God is not ashamed to be called their God. How many times have I brought shame on the name of God? To think that God could call me into a life, that he could call me into a relationship with him where he loves me enough to give forgiveness for the things that I've done that have brought reproach upon his name, for the times that I've dishonored his name. And to know that he has prepared a place for me. There's a place with my name on it. There's a place with your name on it. And there's a God who longs to embrace you, who longs to see you face to face, who longs to tell you that he loves you, and who longs to say, I'm not ashamed of you. You are my child. And yet there are times when this world becomes so difficult that we consider giving up faith. We consider walking away from it. We consider that it might be too difficult or it might be too hard. But God calls us to this. God calls us to the place that he has prepared for us, and he wants us there with him. That's good. That's better than anything else that we can imagine. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin, considering the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses gave up being associated with the richest, most powerful family that you can imagine. He gave that all up because it wasn't valuable enough. It wasn't good enough for Moses to have all of the earth's possessions, to have the kind of power that he could wield as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose rather to suffer the reproach of Christ and considered that better than the riches of Pharaoh's household. And he did that because he was looking for a reward. People would look at the way Pharaoh lived and they'd think, how can you get a better reward than that? And Moses was willing to give that up because he was looking for a heavenly reward. He was looking for something that was better. Then verses 32 through 40 summarize the chapter. What more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises at the mouths of lions, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. These great heroes of faith accomplished all of these things, did all of these things, often living with the full knowledge that they would never see the thing that God had promised them. Often living with the idea that it's going to come to a future generation, it's going to come to a future group of people, and they're the ones that are going to receive the promise. I'm not going to receive it, but I'm going to help move the story forward so that it can be received. I'm going to play my part. I'm going to do what God has asked me to do, because there are people coming down the road that need these things. And they were willing to do that for us, to play their part in God's story, to do the things that God asked them to do, so that when the time was right, God could send His Son and those promises could be fulfilled in Him. And now we live a life of faith, demonstrating that love to other people so that they can understand there is a promise awaiting them as well. That's what this story is all about. Not giving up, but persevering to the end and realizing that it is faith that will preserve our soul. And so chapter 11 actually ends at the beginning of chapter 12. Chapter 12, well, 1 Peter, I got another slide there. 1 Peter 1, verses 10 through 12 tell us kind of that same idea about those that longed to see the things that they were being told about, but they knew they were never going to see them. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 to 12 says, "As to this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you made careful search and inquiry, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as He predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you in these things, which now have been announced to you through those who preach the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit, sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look." Even the angels long to peer into the mystery of Christ that has been revealed to us. The life that we get to live in Christ, angels look at that life and they say, wow, that'd be pretty cool. That'd be pretty neat to experience what they get to experience in Christ. And the prophets that told us about Christ longed to understand it better, longed to have more knowledge of it. But God said the time is not yet right. And so by faith, they fulfilled their role. They did what God asked them to do. And now, Hebrews chapter 11 ends with the first verses of Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. We've got to open our eyes to the unseen. We can't be distracted by the things that this world throws at us. When we do, then we come up with ideas like maybe it's better to give up Christ. Maybe it's better to go our own way and do our own thing. But we've got to focus on the unseen. And one of those things that the Hebrew writer here tells us is unseen is this great cloud of witnesses. I don't see Abraham. He's not here tonight. I don't see Enoch. I don't see David. I don't see Noah. I don't see Rahab. I don't see any of those people that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. And yet the Hebrew writer tells me they're here. They're there. They're here. They are surrounding us as a cloud of witnesses, cheering us on as we make our way toward the finish line. Did you have any following of sports during that recent pandemic that we went through? You remember when they started having sports again? I remember vividly the first basketball game that I announced as the announcer for the McPherson Bullpups in a gym with fewer than 50 people in it that seats 3,500 people. Every player that was on the team got to have 2 people come and watch. And so fewer than 50 fans in the stands, and I was announcing a basketball game. Wasn't great. And you'd turn on the TV and you'd watch an NFL game, and they had cardboard cutouts in the stands. And you turned on the live stream of the McPherson Church of Christ, and there were puppets for the kids to look at in the front row, and it wasn't great. But we have a cloud of witnesses, and we may not be able to see them. We may not be able to physically hear them, but we know that as we are running our race, they are cheering us on every step of the way. And when we stumble, when we fall, there's no booing, there's no hissing, there's encouragement. There's hope being expressed that we can get up and carry on. And that cloud of witnesses is made up of all the people that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11. And it's made up of the people that you know in your life that have gone on before you. Those people that you consider to be your personal heroes of faith, that you know that nobody else here even knows. They're in that cloud of witnesses, and they are telling you that you can do this. You can make it. You can finish the race. And we focus on the unseen by fixing our eyes on Jesus. When we focus on Christ, we think about what He has done for us and the fact that He is better than anything else that is out there. And we stay focused on Him through the difficulties and the trials and the pain and the hurt of this life. Then we know that we can make it. Tonight, I hope that your focus is on Christ. If it's not, if it hasn't been, you can refocus tonight. If you have need to do that, I hope that you'll come while we stand and sing.